Hello, and welcome to something of a remake to our very first episode of LoreDive, where we look into the lore of various video games to analyze and explain aspects of the game's story. Today we will be looking at the game Dead by Daylight, an asymmetrical horror game where one killer must hunt down and kill up to 4 survivors. For this remake of our first episode, we will be re-examining the center that holds this story together, the creature and presence known only as the Entity. Not much is known about the being solely identified as the Entity, but what we do know is that it is responsible for bringing the various killers and survivors together and creating the playing field for the killers to hunt. Not seen in the procedurals until it is spurred into action, the Entity is an enigma that's true motives can only be guessed. After being ensnared by the Entity, a man by the name of Benedict Baker began documenting everything he could about the creature, leaving behind his journals that would further explain what he believes the creature to be. In his eyes, the Entity is an evil and malevolent creature that exists between reality and imagination. A creature outside of our existence, peering in and grasping at aspects that it needs or desires. The Entity does not eat in the way that most beings do, and instead must feed on hope and despair. In order to facilitate this need, it has created a setting in order to make an endless loop, where it can feed off the struggles between the killers and the survivors, provide itself endless sustenance. The Entity pulls these beings into its world by reaching into various realities, unburdened by time or realm of existence. Pulling people from the far past, from realms where the world has become a walking apocalypse, and from dark and twisted variants of the normal world. In its search, it touches those that are weak to its influence, or attempts to abduct anyone that it desires for its trials. The first beings that it most likely captured were those who were susceptible to performing horrible acts of violence. And if Baker's journals are correct, the Entity may have influenced some of these terrifying murders to begin with. These killers can come from all walks of life, some not even being human. While there are certainly killers that are dark and rotten to the core, others found themselves on this path by pure circumstance. To the Entity, it doesn't matter, as either way they can serve its ultimate purpose. After folding these killers into its realm, it then imposes its own will upon them, making them hunt down the innocents that it ensnares. It is likely that some of these murderers and creatures it pulls into its realm are more than willing to hunt down survivors without end, while others had to be coerced. The prey for these hunters would be the uncorrupted, the survivors. These otherwise normal people are pulled into the Entity's realm for one purpose only, to help produce the fuel for the Entity. It isn't entirely known how the Entity chooses its victims, as who is pulled into the realm varies, but it seems that early on the Entity would only capture the lost or those nearing death. As time passed, though, the Entity has been emboldened by its success, pulling those it wants with no such requirement. The survivors have no memory of how they end up in the realm of the Entity, but all who are ensnared wake up by the campfire, a temporary haven in this realm of darkness, and from here they are firmly in the being's clutches. After the pawns have been gathered, the Entity summons a realm to put the pieces in a ritual which is now known as the Procedural. These realms are locations filled with violence and tragedy, and act as hollow memories that originate from one or multiple beings that it has captured. These procedurals give a hint as to the limits of the Entity's abilities and imagination. While it can create a mimic of these locations, it never gets things quite right. Inanimate objects can often be in the wrong place, or change locations each time a new procedural begins. Machinery often doesn't work, or lacks the parts that would require it to function in the normal world, making it seem like the Entity can copy these objects without full understanding of their purpose. Once all the pieces have been set, the game begins. The killers are given one simple goal: find the survivors and put them on twisted versions of meat hooks that litter the realm. From these meat hooks, the Entity will begin to reach into the procedural in order to pluck the hope and despair that has accrued from the survivors' still living bodies, and feast upon it. After it has fully appeared, it will not take the survivor immediately, and instead it will struggle with them, further drawing out their dread. During this time, if another survivor appears and manages to detach their comrade from their prison, the entity will retract and allow the escape. If a survivor is brought back to the entity after having struggled with it, the entity will immediately grab them and pull them from the realm. Once a survivor has been pulled from a hook in this way, the hook they were on is immediately destroyed. This is true for every hook in the realm, all but 4. These hooks reside in the killer's lair that appears in every realm, an area simply known as the basement. The survivors are given a decidedly different task, as meat hooks aren't the only things that are scattered in the area. Placed around the procedural are several generators, and up to 5 must be powered in order to open one of 2 large exit gates. Opening these gates will allow the survivors a chance to escape the procedural and return to the campfire, where the entire process will begin again. Once a gate has been opened, and a procedural is nearing its end, the entire realm will begin to collapse. From here, the survivors have a limited amount of time to actually escape the realm before the entity takes them by force. If a survivor fails to escape and is sacrificed to the entity, they will still awaken next to the campfire, though a little more hollow and with a little less hope than when they initially left. It isn't entirely known what happens to a survivor if they completely lose their hope. Some believe that the entity simply tosses them into an endless void, but Baker believed that they may become another killer under the control of the entity. The connection between the entity has side effects for both the killers and the survivors. The killers are significantly connected to the entity, with all receiving a boost to strength and speed, as well as abilities unique to each killer, making them a force to be reckoned with. This connection causes the survivors to see a red stain in front of the killer, giving them an opportunity to see where the killer is and what they are observing. As the killers serve under the entity, they develop the ability to pluck power from it, including unique abilities known as perks. Survivors, on the other hand, have a fairly light connection to the entity, but like the killers, they can also learn to pull power from it in order to assist them in the procedurals. Over time, the killers can learn others' perks, as can survivors, allowing for more versatility in the procedurals. Certain individuals with enough power, both killer and survivor, can even force the entity to intervene on their behalf. The procedurals can be influenced even further with offerings that it allows survivors and killers to pluck from its mind. These offerings are obtained while both killers and survivors dream, and they find themselves delving into the entity's subconscious, a metaphysical place known as the blood web. Here, offerings and items and power to learn new abilities taught by others can be obtained. This process is something that the entity is surprisingly happy to offer up to those who delve into its mind, for a price. The entire point of the procedural is the struggle for the survivors to stay alive, and for the killer to hunt its prey. If the balance is tipped too far towards one side's favor, the entity will become dissatisfied with the results. A killer who prevents any sort of hope for the survivors to escape from a hook, or fails to adequately draw out all the aspects of hope and despair that the entity desires, will be punished by not receiving as much power as they would have received otherwise. Likewise, survivors that work too well with each other by using power outside the entity's control, making escape far too easy, can also be punished similarly. These killers and survivors intentionally, or unintentionally, make life harder for all sides of the conflict, as instead of the emotions and energy that is supposed to be produced, all that is gained from such actions is an overwhelming feeling of resentment from all sides. Though a force to be reckoned with, the entity is not all-powerful. From time to time, killers manage to wrest themselves away from the control of the entity temporarily, and occasionally, the entity manages to disconnect from a killer or survivor completely. If the entity manages to lose connection to a survivor, a hollow shell will remain, unable to move or act. If the entity loses connection to a killer, it forcefully stops the procedural in its tracks. It does, however, appear that the entity has been learning and finding new ways to keep the procedural going even if this happens. Some have talked about a killer or survivor that suddenly changes, while they still go through the motions that they would have otherwise. If you manage to look into their eyes, there is nothing behind them, just a blank-faced doppelganger. going through the motions as the entity's puppet. There are also aspects of the procedurals that the entity has no control over, such as the hatch that will open only when one survivor remains, as this hatch is neither created nor controlled by the entity. There is also one more thing that we have learned about the entity. One thing that no one could ever truly have suspected. One thing that shatters all notions of what this creature is and what it desires. The entity really likes cake. Thank you for watching this remake of the very first episode of LoreDive. When I originally created the first episode, I decided to do this weird voice that didn't end up really working out very well. So I wanted to go back in, kind of update the video, as well as add a few new aspects to it. For those who are interested, I finally set up my Patreon, which you can see in the link down below. So if you are interested, I have a few tiers available. I'm going to add more to it as time goes on, but right now, this seemed like a very good base place to start. Some of the tiers include the ability to access the exclusive Discord for the channel, as well as the ability to vote on upcoming content. If you can't or simply don't want to donate, that's perfectly fine. It'd still be helpful if you could like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, commenting down below really helps. And I've seen a few interesting discussions come out from some of these videos. Anyway, that's it for today. I thank you as we looked back into the entity's background. I hope you all are doing well out there. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.